Imagine waking up, turning on Good Morning Britain, and watching Ed Balls interview Rachel Reeves about her catastrophic budget while his wife, Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper, was literally sitting next to Reeves on the front bench the day before, nodding along like a supportive bobblehead. That's not just a conflict of interest. That's conflict of interest doing interpretive dance while wearing a sign saying this is absolutely inappropriate and everyone can see it. Welcome to British broadcasting in 2025, where the lines between journalism and political cheerleading have become so blurred they might as well not exist. Welcome back to UK Political Insight, where today we're unpacking the absolute car crash that was Rachel Reeves appearing on Good Morning Britain to defend her budget, interviewed by a man whose wife sits in cabinet with her, while viewers at home screamed at their televisions about bias and demanded both of them be sacked. Because nothing says balanced journalism quite like having a former Labour politician married to a current cabinet minister conduct a friendly chat with the Chancellor who just delivered the most unpopular budget since the invention of taxation. So let's start with the gloriously awkward setup that had viewers reaching for the complaint button faster than Reeves reached for people's wallets in her budget. Rachel Reeves rocks up to Good Morning Britain on Thursday, November 27th, the day after unveiling her controversial autumn budget. She's already facing massive criticism from basically everyone. The public is furious, businesses are screaming, even her own party members are privately wondering what on earth she was thinking. And who does ITV decide should interview her? Ed Balls, former Labour shadow chancellor, husband of Yvette Cooper, the man whose wife was literally sitting next to Reeves in the comments just yesterday. The conflict of interest is so blindingly obvious that you'd need to be deliberately obtuse not to see it. Actually, scratch that. You'd need to be in an alternate dimension where professional ethics and journalistic standards don't exist to think this was an appropriate interview arrangement. Ed Balls interviewing his wife's cabinet colleague about a budget that his wife voted for and supports is like asking someone to objectively review their own wedding. The bias isn't subtle, it's practically wearing neon lights and doing cartwheels. Viewers notice this immediately because people aren't stupid, even if broadcasters sometimes treat them like they are. Within seconds of the interview starting, social media exploded with complaints. One viewer raged that Ed Balls should not be interviewing his wife's colleague who sat next to her on the front bench yesterday, pointing out that he's an ex-Labour chancellor who's pro-Reeves agenda and clearly biased. That's not opinion, that's observable fact. Ed Balls has every personal and professional reason to be sympathetic to Rachel Reeves, and precisely zero reasons to give her the kind of tough interrogation this budget deserves. Another viewer highlighted the smoking gun moment when Ed literally said to Reeves, "Great budget, just shame it was leaked." Great budget. He called it a great budget, the most unpopular fiscal announcement in recent memory, the budget that's got pub landlords banning MPs and farmers planning tractor protests, the budget that earned Reeves the nickname Christmas Grinch, and Ed Balls thinks it's great. If that's not biased broadcasting, then words have lost all meaning and we're living in some kind of post-truth hellscape where up is down and black is white. A third viewer pointed out the absurdity of the situation perfectly, asking, wasn't Ed's wife sitting next to Reeves yesterday nodding her head in agreement? Yes she was. Yvette Cooper was right there on the front bench, physically next to the Chancellor, visibly supporting the budget that was being announced. And now, less than 24 hours later, her husband is conducting what's supposed to be a challenging interview with that same Chancellor. The words conflict of interest don't even begin to cover how inappropriate this is. Another viewer called it farcical, which is probably the most restrained British description of the situation. How can Good Morning Britain question the Chancellor with any credibility when the wife of one of the presenters was sat next to her on the front bench in the Commons yesterday? The answer, of course, is that they can't. There is no credibility here. The entire premise is compromised from the start. It's like having a defense lawyer interview the prosecution's key witness and expecting everyone to believe it's a fair and balanced examination of the facts. The absolute best viewer response claimed that Ed Balls and Rachel Reeves have something in common. They both need sacking. That's the kind of savage British humor that makes political discourse in this country simultaneously depressing and entertaining. Sack the Chancellor for delivering a terrible budget. Sack the presenter for being so obviously biased that even casual viewers can spot it immediately. Clean house and start over with people who understand concepts like journalistic ethics and political competence. But here's where things get really spicy, because despite Ed Balls being softer than a marshmallow factory, Susanna Reid absolutely went for the jugular. And this is important because it shows that even with one presenter being completely compromised, the other one was determined to ask the questions that needed asking. Susanna questioned how the British public could trust anything Reeves says after she broke promises pledged in Labour's manifesto. That's the kind of direct, uncomfortable question that politicians hate and that journalists should be asking all the time. Reeves' response was a masterclass in political evasion and semantic gymnastics. She claims she's not pretending yesterday wasn't asking working people to contribute more, but because of other changes around gambling taxes and higher value properties, she kept it to an absolute minimum. That's such obvious spin it makes you dizzy. She's essentially saying, yes, I'm taking more of your money, but look over there at these other things I did. Aren't they distracting enough that you'll forget about the money I'm taking? Susanna wasn't having any of it. She hit back with the central question that cuts through all the political waffle. When you make a promise in a manifesto that millions of people vote on, when you make a promise publicly in the House of Commons, do we acknowledge that we can't believe those promises because they could be broken? That's absolutely devastating because it's not about this specific budget. It's about whether anything any politician says can be trusted. If manifesto commitments mean nothing, if explicit promises can be casually discarded, then democracy itself starts to break down because voters have no way of knowing what they're actually voting for. The Chancellor tried to claim the manifesto specifically said rates, trying to lawyer her way out of the promise by focusing on technical definitions. But then she recognized, at least partially, that they have asked people to contribute more by freezing thresholds for an additional 3 years. So she's simultaneously claiming they didn't break their promise and admitting that they asked people to contribute more. You can't have it both ways. Either you're keeping your promise not to increase taxes on working people, or you're asking them to contribute more. Those two things are mutually exclusive. The freeze admission is important because it reveals how Labour is trying to have their cake and eat it too. They can technically claim they haven't raised tax rates, which is true in the narrowest possible sense. But by freezing thresholds while inflation and wages rise, they're ensuring that more people pay higher rates of tax without actually changing the rates themselves. It's a stealth tax increase, and everyone knows it. The only people who pretend otherwise are politicians trying to avoid admitting they broke their promises. What makes this interview such a car crash is the combination of Ed Balls being obviously biased and sympathetic, while Susanna Reid is doing actual journalism and holding Reeves accountable. You've got one presenter essentially cheering on the Chancellor, while the other one is pointing out that she's broken fundamental promises to voters. It creates this bizarre dynamic where you're watching two completely different interviews happening simultaneously in the same studio. The viewer fury about Ed Balls being involved is completely justified because it undermines the credibility of the entire program. Good Morning Britain is supposed to be a news program that holds politicians accountable, not a platform for friendly chats between political allies. When viewers can't trust that they're getting fair and balanced questioning because of obvious conflicts of interest, the program fails in its basic mission. And ITV should have known better to put Ed Balls in this position. Either they genuinely didn't see the problem, which suggests incompetence, or they did see it and went ahead anyway, which suggests they don't care about journalistic standards. The fact that Balls called it a great budget tells you everything about where his loyalties lie. He's not approaching this as a journalist trying to interrogate government policy. He's approaching it as a Labour Party member who wants to support his colleagues and his wife's government. That's a perfectly natural human impulse, but it's completely incompatible with the role of a television presenter interviewing a government minister about controversial policies. Susanna Reid's performance in this interview is what journalism should look like. She came prepared with actual quotes from the manifesto. She challenged Reeves when she tried to spin or evade. She interrupted when the Chancellor was saying things that weren't true. And she asked the fundamental questions about trust and broken promises that voters want answered. The contrast between her approach and Ed Balls' approach couldn't be starker, and it highlights exactly why the conflict of interest matters so much. The broader issue this raises is about how cozy the relationship between media and politics has become in Britain. You've got former politicians working as television presenters, you've got journalists taking jobs in government communications, you've got constant crossover between Westminster and the media world. Sometimes this provides valuable insight and expertise, but it also creates situations like this where the boundaries between journalism and political advocacy become impossibly blurred. Rachel Reeves must have thought appearing on Good Morning Britain with Ed Balls would be a relatively friendly environment where she could defend her budget without facing too much hostility. And she was probably right about Ed Balls. He was exactly as sympathetic as you'd expect given his connections. But she clearly didn't anticipate that Susanna Reid would come armed with manifesto quotes and direct challenges about broken promises. The result was a chancellor who looked uncomfortable, evasive, and unable to defend her own policies with anything more than semantic games about what specific words in the manifesto meant. The calls for both Balls and Reeves to be sacked might seem harsh, but they reflect genuine frustration from viewers who feel like they're not being given honest information or fair journalism. When the presenter is biased toward the politician, when the politician is breaking manifesto promises, when the whole setup feels like a stage-managed PR exercise rather than genuine accountability, people get angry. They feel like they're being treated as mugs who can't see what's obviously happening.